Make sure I'm unmuted here.
Yep, I can hear you.
All right, good. Well, at least you can hear me. Hopefully, everybody can hear me on this April 26th of 2024. Welcome to the Dev Talk Show, and I'm Chris Gomez, along with it's that way, isn't it? along with
He's over there.
along with
Morning,
my
Chris.
co-host Rich Ross. So, how is it going?
It's going. It's been a while. It's been a couple
Yeah.
weeks for me. You had a awesome solo show while I was away traveling for work. But yeah, it's good to be back and do a show before I start traveling again next week. So
Yeah, and then I also think let's see, it's been a blur the last week or so for me, but in the meantime, we also had Philly.net Code Camp, which was a local event here at the in the Philly area, and you had that particular event. There were 3-hour sessions, morning and afternoon, and you had one dealing with I'm going to totally sell it short by saying dealing with AI, where there was much broader than that, and then also I also talked about Blazor, so
yeah,
that was a fun time.
It was fun. It was a generative AI talk, so a little bit of background level setting on generative AI, like how it, not so much how it works, like to that level, but just in general what it is, being a language model and not a truth model, those kind of conversations. And it was a great interactive session. We had a full room and it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was fun. And then afterwards I tried to do, it was weird. I'll be honest, I didn't feel that it landed maybe where I thought it was going to, but it was trying to be an introduction to, like a practical introduction to Blazor in here in .NET 8. But at the same time, provide some deep dive opportunity. And, what I realized at the end is the 3 hours went really quick. And I said, man, you could easily have like a whole weekend workshop just on this. So that's okay. You learn from these things. And that's why I like doing it and then I get to, even I think both of us, you learn from trying things out with folks. And you just rework the session and do it again another time. So
that's it. It becomes the basis for that next one we've got to get in front of people on. So yeah, absolutely. I thought it was. I'll be honest. I was in and out, but the parts I was there for, I thought it was really very informative, and I think to a right technical depth from a code camp perspective. So I think it was really good.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So here on the show, if you've worked with us for a while, you've known that we've spent quite a bit of time with Blazor as it sits in .NET 8 and ASP.NET Core 8. To get all that terminology, I think, correct. And we spent a lot of time on render modes early on, and then have recently spent a lot of time with authentication and authorization. And I think it's because the option in the templates that gives you individual accounts, it sets you up, it sets your application up, but then you're left wondering, what do I do next? So we've been concentrating on that. And I think if you've been following along, you also know that we have, I think, intentionally concentrated on the server side modes. So that's the default server side rendering that happens to every component. And then we've touched interactive server a little bit. And today we are going to take what I think is our first look at the client render modes, which is InteractiveWebAssembly and InteractiveAuto in terms of authentication. Like, we've discussed InteractiveAuto here on this show and the implications for your app. But this is the first time that I think we're going to say, okay, so now that folks who followed along may feel more confident to implement this from scratch, what changes when you bring interactive WebAssembly in?
So as we switch modalities there, I think that's because a lot of people are asking that question too, right? Because that's another, if you have an app that you're building that's in that direction, definitely an interest to see how that works from that perspective. So
yeah,
and there's a whole bunch of different considerations that you don't have to think about when you're doing things server side. So,
right. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And what we're going to see starting off, if you've been following along on the show, you'll see that this is a application where we did file new project, but we did not include any authentication option. We left the individual accounts choice, just left that as none. And also in that particular implementation, we also are not including any interactive render modes. And the purpose of this was to really try to strip it away and say, okay, if I have to add back authentication, what do we do? And you can see that where we're at is the ability to sign in with just a name. So if you're watching us for the first time and you say, wait a second, where's the password? The point of this sample is not yet to discuss the proper storage of user account credentials. The point of this sample is to say, can I sign someone in and get the ASP.NET auth cookie set? And then the rest of the application, quote unquote, knows who they are. And so, frankly, all you got to do to sign in here is put in any name, and that's you. You're logged in as that. There's no backing database. There's no password check. And so this is not production code. This was simply to say, can we sign someone in using ASP.NET identity? And then I can log out as well. And then I've also got Microsoft authentication here, and I happen to be logged in with my Microsoft account here. And so this one says, okay, fine, you're logged in. Now, if you've been watching, there's an interesting caveat to this one, Rich, that you may not be aware of.
Okay.
The documentation for this in Learn, the learn.microsoft.com, the docs, when you say how to log in from an external account, they set the option in your Entra ID app registration. They set it to personal accounts or from your tenant. They do an or there.
Yeah.
And I suspect many people click that or. And so I'm logged in with my personal Microsoft account now. This was not me. This account, that this particular web browser, because nowadays with web browsers, whether you're in any web browser, you've had these profile options, and so they're keeping your cookies and logins like compartmentalized.
Right.
So this is my personal Microsoft account. So now the question might be, well, wait a second. If you've been watching, didn't when you went and set up your Entra ID app registration, didn't you say single tenant only? And I did. But then I went out to the users section for the tenant, and I added my personal Microsoft account to it.
Okay.
So a little tricky, and not because I suggest you do this. It was just so that I didn't constantly come here and go, oh, I can't use this. Hold on, let me go open another browser. So that's not, not necessarily saying you would do that for production.
Right.
So the other thing, following along real quick, because we're going to leave this sample. So if you've watched this sample, we're going to leave this sample for now. If you've watched this sample and you've said, hey, I think that's really cool, but when I've been playing with the templates, it's this whole page-based login. Well, we have a login component, because what we're trying to do is say, can we get login into a component? Can we get log out into a component? And then can we even go, further in the future and maybe try to figure out how to even compartmentalize that more? So, this is just a start. And so folks who have been following along, you probably are kind of used to this, and you maybe even remember some of this stuff. But what we're going to do today, this is our first look and trying to understand the difference between server-side and client-side auth in Blazor. And the reason why I'm bringing up our current project is because before we detour, we're going to look at Program CS very quickly. So I'm going to hit the big stop button there. Our Program CS for server, for an application that you started from scratch and you want to be able to sign people in, we discovered that you need an authentication state provider. Without a service called the authentication state provider of some kind, and whatever you inject in here is your choice, but we are choosing the one in the box. When I say in the box, I mean that because It is from Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Components, which always tells you you're using something that's provided by the team, by the platform.
Yeah.
The server authentication state provider is the one that you will see the templates using, whether you're doing no interactivity at all or server-side interactivity with SignalR. So we went with it, and it worked. But then our authentication section is going to look different from what you might be used to in the templates. We are deliberately and very we're very deliberately supplying the default sign-in scheme to authentication and saying that we would like to have cookie authentication use that same sign-in scheme. So what's a sign-in scheme? At its core, it's merely a string where you are telling identity, this particular action is part of this whole sign-in process. So what I'm basically telling it is when you sign someone in, go create a cookie, put that in their browser. And that's common web authentication.
Yeah,
and then we're adding
sense.
the Google and Microsoft options, really. So
Okay.
I wanted to drill in on this. This is going to become important. The server authentication state provider. That's going to be one of the biggest things we notice. The rest of this is pretty straightforward. Map identity endpoints is actually our own version of this. It's not the one that came in the template. And it was, again, the whole point of this has been, let's do this from scratch so that we can learn how this stuff really works. But this is going to end up being a key piece. This is at least my take as I started looking a little bit at the client stuff. One of the things, is there's no way in our show today that we're going to get to where we are implementing this from scratch. We are exploring how it works in the templates so that in a future show, you're going to see this title come up. It's going to be like Blazor Client Auth from scratch. And then you're going to know we're going to go for it, right? So I am going to bring up a project here that, and as we do this, this is another Visual Studio project. As we do this, the key place to look is right here. I'll try to say it each time. The name of this project is InteractiveWasm. That's the key place to look. And it's because this was a file new project where I chose the individual accounts option because we want to see what they're doing. And I chose global interactive WebAssembly.
Okay.
So we know that's the way this is set up because if I go into, I always go into routes.razor when I mean to go into
app,
right? I go to app.razor. And in an interactive WebAssembly app, the way global render modes are set is here in AppRazor.
Mm-hmm.
The two root, I suppose you could come in here and change this. Like nobody's saying you can't come in. You own app.razor. This is yours.
Yeah.
I suspect most people aren't tinkering with this too much. The two root, and to avoid some of our friends maybe who say this word root, I mean root like the root of a tree. The two root components in a Blazor app are the roots component and the head outlet component that basically the head outlet component lets you modify the head, and the roots component sets up Blazor to know how to route page calls.
Okay.
As you can see, these say render mode is render mode for page, whatever render mode for page is, whatever that value is. And we can see right here, render mode for page is a quick little a method here. I think these are called expression bodied methods, right? That's the official name. So a method here that says what we want to do is we want to say the render mode for the page, if the HTTP context for this page, this is really interesting to me. Mm-hmm. If the HTTP context path, let's dive into HTTP context and look at the path of what you're requesting. And if it starts with /account, then don't set the render mode at all here.
Oh.
What the effect of this is, the net effect of this is to say the render mode is going to drop back to the default, which is server-side rendering.
Okay.
There's an important reason for that. If what you are requesting does not start with /account, then interactive WebAssembly. this is very different. This is different from if you were to do file new project and choose none for individual for authentication.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you choose none, then you can simply come here and just say render mode is interactive WebAssembly and you're done.
Done. Yeah.
Yeah. But this is a clever way to sneak server-side rendering back into this. And I'm going to ask, and I hate to put Rich on the spot. It's a total pop quiz. You can answer in the comments. We can see nobody wins anything.
Yep.
Why does this option for individual accounts, why does it need to do this kind of tap dance here at the global top of the, root of the tree of your render tree? Why does it need to do that?
Are you talking? So if you're,
maybe I didn't.
Why
ask
are we
it very
doing that
well.
for our particular use case, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So because if I follow this right, the interactive WebAssembly has things on the client side, and things on the client side are essentially readable by people who they're I don't say plain text, but you essentially get access to that and see that information. So some of the things we're doing, especially around authentication, have secrets or have certain URLs in there that we don't want to have people to see. So we're taking that, we want to take that part of the workload and not have it run on the client, but actually have it go back to server side running like we did in the previous show.
Yep. That's exactly it. Is 100%. Rich wins. He gets authentication and authorization, frankly, are at their heart server-side activities. If your application is running on a mobile device, whether it's running on a web browser, whether it's a native app running on a mobile device, in the end, when somebody fires up your app without a connection to some kind of server, it is at least to kick the ball down the, to get it rolling. Boy, I was only going to mix that metaphor up there. In order to get the ball rolling, you must somehow prove to something who you are. And I can't do that purely disconnected. Get on an airplane. I cannot. And I always use the airplane example because, of course, nowadays we're getting Wi-Fi on planes and stuff. But the classic example of get on an airplane, no connectivity, and I'm not logged in, I can't log in. There's no way to do it. It can't be done. Right. So I want to stress that what I am not saying is that you can't build offline apps with Blazor or the web or native apps. Of course you can build offline apps. And that is like a whole different show and a whole different topic that will be fun to tackle.
Yeah.
But in that case, it's more about, okay, I can't prove who you are, but I might create scenarios to just sort of trust you until I get a chance to prove who you are. And then once I do that, maybe I'll send your data along and try to refresh things and maybe push the work that you've worked on. But that proof still has to happen. And so long story short, this little bit of code that how many people are going to open this template and never look at this in app.razor is saying, I want to double check that what you're requesting is not in the /account section, which is where they have put all of the page components that are going to get called to do all of the login, log out, registration, sending emails, resetting passwords, all running server side.
Mm-hmm.
And we can tell this, first of all, because look at the projects it's in. It's in the top project that doesn't have a name. It doesn't say .server or anything. And it's not in the client project. It's not here. There's no pages here. The second piece of that is if I click on account and I say identity components, endpoint route builder, these are all of the little minimal APIs that perform the server-side logout, the server-side external login, the server-side authentication for two-factor. This is all happening server-side, and guess what? They are all mapped to respond to /account. So they have got all the eggs in the /account basket, whether you're a component, a page component, an endpoint. It's all in this basket ready to run server-side. So that might be the first piece of news to you. If you have run this template and said, okay, all right, I got a client app. Here I am, WebAssembly, go. Well, there's still a little bit of server-side going on. I don't know if that's a surprise to anyone, but at least now we know.
I think it is. I mean, it's,
Yeah.
when you think about it that way, and the fact that there are, with the accounts folder only being up there, there might be other things potentially that you want to run on the server and not on the client, and that is where the pattern essentially of how you might do that. Say
Right.
if accounts is one thing, maybe it's secure communication, whatever it is, right? That goes up there. Just throwing out an idea, but
No, you're right.
If we did that, then on our app.razor, not to take us too far on a crazy tangent, but we would basically just drop another section in there that would look for that route as well.
So that's a good point. If you needed more server-side work and you didn't want to stash it here, then this is a technique that you could use to essentially say, I know I said global. I know I said that every component in this app is going to be interactive WebAssembly. However, let's just really quickly see if this page I intend to be server-side. And then you're essentially stripping away the render mode. And there's a reason they use null, because they don't want to override what you might do in that individual page. One thing about global is, so global sets what global means in Blazor is global means that we have set the render mode at the root, the bottom-most component, or the topmost component, however you want to look at it. Right. And Blazor cascades down render modes unless a component in the render tree says, I'm different.
Yeah.
So even if you're not doing this individual accounts trick, you said none, I don't need authentication, your app Razor is still going to look like this. And you still have the ability in a component or in a page component, also known as a routable component, to say the render mode for this is interactive server. The render mode for this is no interactivity, but I'm using stream rendering, right? I mean, you can do that. Now, I'm not here to say that that's like the greatest practice, but also this depends on your use case. You might have a use case that really makes sense. So then you say to yourself, well, I have this use case that makes sense, but I think what they wanted to do, another way to have accomplished this would have been to run around, and except it wouldn't, I don't think it would have worked for everything, is it would have run around and said, okay, well, actually, no, I think it would have. Let's go to each page and let's set the render mode directly. And they just chose not to do that, right? They chose not to do that. And maybe part of that is so that template code remains the same. And so you don't have all this confusion of go here, go here, go here, go here. That might have been the reason, I think. So
I can see that.
Yeah. And I believe, although I haven't proven yet, that this render mode for page is only going to apply to components. So that does mean essentially, pages, or the use of the title component, not the title component, the use of components that affect head outlet or pages. I don't necessarily believe, although I'm not sure because I haven't sat down to prove it, that it's going to affect calling these minimal API mappings.
Okay.
Because I don't see that route coming through the Blazor tree. But I'm willing to say that maybe I'm overlooking something when I say that. I feel like what's going to happen is ASP.NET Core is going to say, okay, I've got something for /account. Blazor, is this routable? And Blazor's going to say, no, I don't have any idea what, I'm sorry, I'm jumping around. I don't have any idea what perform external login. That's not me. I'm not routing that. I am routing account, but I'm not routing this. And so then Blazor says, ASP.NET Core says, okay, fine. Well, let me go ask the next thing in the pipeline. And the next thing is this. And it says, yep, I'll take that one. Yep, so you're not in Blazor at all. I'm pretty sure about that. Maybe I kind of feel bad. Maybe I should have proven it on my own before doing the show, but that's okay. So we spent a lot of time talking about this. Now, let's go take a look at a couple things. People who have been using interactive WebAssembly or InteractiveAuto are probably aware that you have a program CS that lives on the client, on the server side, and you also have a program CS in a client project that lives on the client side, so to speak. This is the stuff that's getting compiled to WebAssembly. This is the stuff that's going to get sailed down to the device. And to your point earlier, Rich, it's the stuff that anybody can open up, and being persistent enough. Let's just assume that if you're persistent enough, you can probably decompile it back to .NET code.
Sure.
I think that's the safest way to go about it, is just assume, even when you minimize and minify and whatever and bundle your JavaScript and you send that down to the browser, just assume that they've got your source code. Yeah. I think that's the easiest way to go about life as a developer. Just assume they've got it and it's deminified and it looks great. All those tokens have been turned back into the original method names. It's the easiest way to write your code, so that you're sitting there thinking, like, write my code as if the attacker is sitting here with me. So, and what do I not want you to see? And then let's presume that we're going to write good code that they're never going to see the server side. So
yep.
Let's start with, remember how earlier I talked about how server authentication provider was going to become important? It's because in Blazor, in the templates, when you say interactive WebAssembly, we use a different authentication state provider. We use one called the persisting server authentication state provider.
Okay.
Now, I like to show this to people. If you've been watching me for a while, you'll know that I like to zoom in on the IntelliSense or the tooltip or sometimes I don't remember what each feature is called, but I think this might be IntelliSense tooltip or editor tooltip. I like to zoom in and say, who owns this? Whose code is this? And note that this is not coming from Microsoft ASP.NET Core components. So you know what I say? That means it's yours.
Right.
And we can find it here in shared. Oh, it wasn't shared. Let's try again. Here it is. Persisting server authentication state provider. This code has been generated for you, and it's been handed to you, and it is now yours. Congratulations, you own some more code. So let's read their comment. This is a server-side authentication state provider that uses persistent component state to flow the authentication state to the client, which is then fixed for the lifetime of the WebAssembly application.
Huh.
What an interesting way. There's a lot in that statement, isn't there? So, yeah.
Especially the meaning of the word fixed.
Right. So, first of all, you might groan a little bit and say, oh, great, they implemented like this one-off thing. Well, not really, because look what it's derived from. Derived from the server authentication state provider. So this is the one in the box that we're seeing used in the other templates. You probably remember the episode, Rich, where we tried writing our own, and then it didn't work.
Yes.
And we said, well, we're out of time, and we don't know why it didn't work. And then in a later episode, we uncovered by drilling in here, I'm going to hit F12 on the server authentication state provider, that you can implement a server authentication state provider, which really does not require much more than this method here, the get authentication state. No, actually, I forget which one it is now. I'm going to fill. Let's double check the authentication state provider. Yes, it's get authentication state async. You implement get authentication state async, and again, if I click in here, we're going to see this is an abstract class, except that it's been implemented. We have implementation. We have an implementation for an event notifying that state change. So we have our event notification implemented for us. But what they're telling you, you've got to go do is you've got to implement, what do I say? What do I return for an authentication state when somebody calls get authentication state async? And that matters because your authentication state, what comes in the box works really well. Probably I'm even willing to bet for most situations. But if it doesn't work for you, you can implement your own.
Yep.
What we didn't implement was this interface, the iHost environment authentication state provider, which basically says, here's an interface that allows me to set the authentication state from the outside. That's important for Blazor because remember, Blazor is component based. So I might have a component that updates authorization state. How do I get in there and tell you?
Yeah.
And so we're not too concerned. We're not re-implementing this. But what's important to note is what when the program CS on the server side, I say server side, the project without the dot, anything on it, the stuff that runs on the server, it's using a persisting server authentication state provider that is given to you in the template, but they're basing it on something we're already familiar with.
Okay.
And all that we're doing in here is we are using a feature of Blazor called persistent component state, which I'm actually going to try and bring up. Let's see. There's a couple things I can bring up here. One is the learn documentation for persistent component state. I'm not sure this is really the best place to look at it. What if I just say persistent component state? I wonder if I'll get a better hit. Search for that in the documentation. I'm not sure if this is it. Persist state for pre-rendered components. I'm actually not sure because they're talking about this for Erasure pages. So maybe, maybe I shouldn't. But what we do have is Jon Hilton has a pretty nice article, in my opinion, to talk about how Blazor authentication, how you can share authentication state, and essentially what happens is he goes through this. He goes through implementing your own persisting authentication state provider. So really, he's kind of getting to the same place, and you can learn a lot about besides what we're talking about here. So we're definitely going to include this in the show notes. We can include it, in the chat. Just do that real quick so everybody can see it. It's really good. It's really good. So what's happening here is we're setting up they're setting up an event for us that they're going to be able to call when the authentication state changes, which I feel like this comment sort of makes you feel like, oh, once you set it, you can't touch it. But that's not true. The persisting server authentication provider for the service, when you grab that service, it can be updated basically by this event can notify different components like, oh, hold on, something's changed. Right. So, the reason why is because your component or application can be paused. The term paused is a little overloaded in this context, but what it means is I might come to the website and your component is running client side. So over on the server side, we haven't heard from you in a while. Mm-hmm. So that doesn't mean your state has to go away. It just means, I don't know, we don't have any threads open about you or anything. So what we're going to make sure we do is we're going to make sure that we persist this state on the interactive WebAssembly side, because your web browser is another thing that might pause your application. People may be aware now. Are you aware that sometimes a tab might go gray, and that's the web browser telling you, like, it doesn't seem like you're here, and this page is running a bunch of JavaScript, and maybe it's showing a video. I don't know. We're just going to pause that.
I see that a lot because I have, dozens of tabs open across multiple browser instances every day. So, yeah, I see that a lot.
Yeah. So part of what we're doing here is we're allowing this to wake up, and we're allowing it to persist authentication state. And when I say we, this is the code that was handed to us. So persisting server authentication state provider. But now, so let's go over to the client program CS. Of course, it's much smaller, but it is also adding a service. And, I'm going to jump back. Note that the persisting server authentication state provider is scoped, which is their way of saying that you get an instance of this service per, let's see, the difference between scoped and transient is scoped is per user session. And transient is like per call. Did I get that backwards?
I don't think you got it backwards, but I thought scoped was a little more refined than just a user session.
I think you're right. I think you're right. So let's see. Let's go ahead and say it's okay. You're maintaining it throughout the HTTP request. That's what it is. So in this service, with every HTTP request, we get a new instance of the service. The same instance is provided for the entire scope of that request. And then if you want to I love all the little pop-ups here. Sorry about that. This is a better option when you want to maintain state within a request. Now, why is this important? Because some of the things that could happen to you is your HTTP request could make an awaitable call out to a database. And as we know, with a sync await and everything that goes on there, when you make that awaitable call out to the database, what the web application does is returns the thread to the thread pool. It's almost kind of like when you go to the drive-through and they say, can you pull up to that spot and we'll bring your food out to you? Because your call to the database might take a little while. So they haven't forgotten about you, but they want to move on and service another request. So the next person pulls up behind you and they get their order and you sit there going like, I don't know why my order wasn't ready. But that's all handled in the web server. That's handled for us by ASP.NET, by .NET, by the web server. So when you come back from that call and they basically rebuild the HTTP context to run things again on the server, that service has to come with it. That instance of the service has to come with it because you said scoped. And we are still in that request. Transient is like, you get a new instance for every object and it doesn't matter about the lifetime. And it just every time, don't use, you don't want to share state in this. It's really good for a multi-threaded approach. So, I suppose one way to look at it is that if your HTTP request maybe creates two instances of the same service, they're going to be different. They'll be different. But so anyways, so now we kind of had that little detour. The reason I want to point that out is notice that this is added scoped on the server side, this persisting server authentication state provider. And now let's head over to the client side. We're getting a singleton here. Persistent authentication state provider. That's a different class. And who owns it? It's yours. Congratulations. This is some code that came in your template. It is an authentication state provider. So let's go look at the persistent authentication state provider. And we get a larger explanation here. This is a client-side authentication state provider that determines the user's authentication state by looking for data persisted in the page when it was rendered on the server. The authentication state will be fixed for the lifetime of the WebAssembly application. So if the user needs to log in or log out, then a page reload is required. And that all is managed for you in this version. This only provides, well, I take it back. I think what they're kind of warning you is that if you do something that causes a sign out async, then you should also make sure you refresh the page. Oh, are you muted real quick? Yeah.
Yes, sorry.
Okay.
I just said that in thinking about it, that makes sense. Yes.
Yeah, right. Because if I say that I logged out on the client, it doesn't mean anything if we don't tell a server. Because we got to tell the server that cookie is no longer good or whatever the method is to log out. It could be, oh, that cookie, first of all, get it out of my browser. And second of all, if you see it again, it's no good, right?
Right.
So when using the template, this can seem transparent to you. This can seem like, oh, this is easy. It's a piece of cake. But as people who have watched us build from scratch know that there was a point in our build from scratch process where we were logging people in. We knew we had them logged in. We saw the cookie appear, all that stuff. But the page didn't update. It just said, the page was just like, I don't know, did you do anything? And it was because we had to add that little bit of code to say, let's refresh this page. Yeah. And then on the refresh, it was like, oh, my HTTP context has a claims principle now. Look at that. And then, now we know you're logged in. So the other thing that's interesting about this is what is provided in a persistent authentication state provider. If you've been reading ahead to line 12 through 14, you already know the answer. But if you think that this provider is getting the contents of the cookie, or maybe the access or refresh token that you might be dealing with if you're building a pure spa. That doesn't come here. All this particular component does is it gets the information about the user. It receives, in this particular example, it receives the user ID and, well, basically these claims, the user ID and the email, right? So what happens is, and we'll go back and look at the other component to try and make it a little more sense, is that the other component is loading up persistent component state. And then this persistent authentication state provider is having persistent component state injected. And it says, okay, well, persistent component state is a key value store in JSON, right? You could just throw a bunch of JSON in there. And so they open up the JSON and they say, let's get out the user info, and whatever's in the user info is fine. And what we're going to do is we're going to look through the user info and look for a claim of name identifier. We'll call that the user ID. The name and the email, we're just going to use email for. So this is something where if you're like, wait a second, this isn't what I want. Or maybe I need something else. Maybe there's some other piece I want. Right. You got to find a way to get it in here if you want it to be pure client side.
Okay.
Now that's not every situation. You might be willing to say, well, I'll get this. This will help me know who's logged in, but then I'm going to go hit the server to find out something else. Okay, fine. But if you're trying to stay pure client side, you've got to pass along. Tell me who this user is for display purposes so that I can say, hi, Rich,
Right.
Or I can even alter my UI to say, well, there's a claim in here that Rich is a manager. Managers get to see this page. So therefore, I will show them that route. Now, don't forget, that's client side. So just assume that somebody's going to figure out how to see that page anyway. So make sure that that page either uses data that you've already brought over in a trustworthy fashion, and you've already got it stored locally in a trustworthy fashion, or it's going to make an API call, and then the API call's got to flow the authentication, which isn't really covered in this, right?
Right.
So I'm sure that went from I sort of get what's going on to confusing. Because if I head back to the persisting server so now we see what they do. This is the persisting provider. My job is to persist that component state. I'm going to persist it, and then the persistent provider says I can go look it up.
Okay.
And that's how in the templates the client side auth works.
Okay.
I'm back in the server side now. We get the persistent component state, and it's injected in. And then we basically say, okay, well, when somebody has created one of these, because like I said, every HTTP request, one of these is going to be created. Let's inject in persistent component state. This is part of Blazor. And let's go ahead and do some stuff. The most important thing is to say that let's get what's currently in there now. And then we will set the ability to register on persisting whenever somebody updates this, because at the time of creating this component, it hasn't been updated yet. So what happens is we start, I don't know that we're going to see any in this project. Okay. We're going to see any use of authentication state changed. No, we're only wiring it up. So the bad news there is you say like, wow, that seems magical. Because what's happening is if somebody goes to log in, let's go ahead and go to the login page. And we go to login user, which is the method that's running when somebody logs in. This is calling other parts of the security model, especially the sign-in manager, which comes with ASP.NET, and password sign-in async. And we would have to start spelunking through here to figure out, okay, well, they're signing in. And I'm not sure if I'm going to find it. They're signing in. So let's check if they can sign in, and let's see if they're signing in or if I have to do two-factor. And is this a two-factor client? Not sure. So let's go ahead, and here's the sign in async. We have everything we need to sign in. And now I'm in a lot of overloads. So it's definitely a little bit of a rabbit hole that we could head down. It's not that we can't. It's just, okay, well, then you end up at that one, and then you end up at that one, and then you end up at that one. Oh, wait, am I going back and forth? No, I hope I'm not. I hope I'm actually getting to a root one eventually.
I'm just looking at the numbers down the side.
It's probably, I feel like, gosh, this is for an authentication scheme. I'd like to believe the one at the bottom is it, but I'm not certain that it is. That's what makes this fun, right?
Mm-hmm.
We would literally, in fact, I don't know, maybe I got to hit back several times. So here's where sign in happens. Here's where the magic happens. If I run this application, which I think, I'm not sure that we'll get through this, but if you run this application, I'm going to have to register a new, this is a brand new application. I'm going to have to register a new login.
Okay.
Probably going to kick off the entity framework stuff. So let's see if we can do this quickly. And then as folks know, I have been using the symbol server. I have disabled debugging just my code. And why do I do that? So that I can set a breakpoint here in ASP.NET code and we can actually review it. Oh, this is really thinking, isn't it? Or did it not? Did it not do it? About blank is not the one I was expecting. I was not expecting about blank. What's the, I'm going to just run that again and cross my fingers that, okay, here we go. So this one, localhost 7075. If I go to log in, I don't have a login, so I'm going to go to register, and we'll go ahead and say, I don't need a real email address because this is not going to actually do the email confirmation. I'm not sure that I got all those things in there. So here's where it pretends. It pretends it was going to fire off an email. Woo! This is the debugging external code that's really hitting me here. I don't think I'm at a breakpoint. No. Okay. All right. We couldn't actually do that. Let's try refreshing the page. Well, sure. Let's resubmit the form. Register confirmation does not have a real email sender. Let's just pretend. So now we're back home. Still not in the app. Now I should be able to log in. We'll use this sample. And I'm going to even say remember so we don't have to do that again. And you know what I was hoping is I was hoping we'd hit this line of code.
We haven't gotten there at all.
No, it didn't happen at all, right? So let's, now I'm logged out. So let's go back to login.razor. And login.razor, we think we're going to get here to log in a user. This is our code now. Login.razor is our code that I can actually click this button up here, sync with active document, and get to. So let's go log in again and see. Okay, await sign-in manager, password, sign-in async. We are providing it with the email, the password, and whether or not we had the remember me box checked, which in this particular case, I did check it. Okay, fine. And lockout on failure. Okay, fine. And we will hit F11. And we ended up here at password sign in async, and we are in ASP.NET code. So this is ASP.NET core code. They go to the user manager. Well, actually, what they're trying to do is, there's some sync await going on. I probably, yeah, that didn't do what I wanted at all. I needed to put a breakpoint here.
Okay.
So this is, if people are wondering, how do you figure this stuff out? And it's like, well, it turns out that this is how. Is you realize that you need to give it another go because you zoomed past the code you were interested in. Okay, so password sign in async. This time I'm just going to go ahead and hit F5 and let it get here. The async await hit me. And now what's going to happen is it's going to call a different version of password sign in async, right? At least I'm guessing. I mean, I don't believe that it's calling itself, although it seems weird, right? I think it seems weird.
Yeah, because it's the same signature, so it should be the same method.
Right. Return await password sign in async. Huh. So I'm going to hit F11 again. No, we're somewhere else. How very interesting. So we're either going to end up here or here.
Okay.
Well, actually, we are going to end up here. We're going to check password sign in async. Okay. So I'm guessing that check password sign in async is going to take me off to use the user manager. Right. We have our user. We have our password. I don't know what this pre-sign in check is. We'll look at that another time. But we skipped over it. And there is a method in user manager called get check password async. So what are user manager? You're seeing user manager show up quite a bit, and sign in manager.
Mm-hmm.
These are implementations of an interface that you get in the box that's already set up and knows how to work with the database-based logins that come in the template.
Okay.
If you want to not use that implementation, then you can implement your own user manager and sign-in manager. What you really do is you implement the user manager and you keep using the default sign-in manager. The sign-in manager abstraction knows how to ask the user manager for things, but it doesn't actually do the asking. So you implement a user manager, and we may have to do that at some point. We have avoided it so far. So we get through, and let's see. I think we're going to end up here. And is it really going to be that's it? We're returning sign-in result success. And it's either return that the attempt succeeded, or we, I guess if it failed, then I think what it's really doing is if it failed, it checks to see if it failed, I'm guessing, because you haven't two-factored. That's my guess. I don't know that for sure. Let's put a breakpoint there to make sure we don't end up here. But I think that that's what's happening. No, we still ended up here. Okay. No, now we're back. We're back. No. We're still in sign-in or two-factor async. Sorry about that. And they're saying, well, who's the login provider? Well, it's null because you don't have a current cookie, so we don't have anything to clean up. And now this is the key. Sign in with claims async. This is the key. This is, I think, where I wanted to be. But once again, we're going to create the claim, and then I don't know what else we're going to create. Oh, no, Visual Studio encountered an unexpected error. That's not going to be good. At least I don't think so. We're winding back up, though. Users logged in and redirect. Okay. So that didn't tell me everything that I wanted. What I'm kind of curious about was I wanted to see the persistent state get stored. And I don't yet know who does that. I just don't know. So if I come to the persistent authentication state provider and set a breakpoint here, and then let's close this. It's going to take a little bit to close. This is the only breakpoint I care about, this one on line 28. So in debug, I can say the breakpoints window, and let's get rid of all the rest of these. I guess I'll just deactivate them for now. Okay. I kind of wanted to see the persistent state component getting written to, but I don't know. Right. Whoops. I don't know that that's going to be simple. So, all right. Oh, well, actually, it's already trying to read it. So we just fired up the app. I guess this makes sense. And it says, if when we take from JSON, if that state doesn't exist or it ends up being null, well, that didn't happen, right? So the state try from take from JSON test worked. They were able to get out this user info. So what's a little curious about this statement, it's using some I don't want to say new, but some C# features maybe we didn't have. Maybe we've had them. We didn't have out var, that's for sure. Is to say, if I can't take from JSON, if I can't do this thing, try take from JSON, then we're just going to get out of here. Okay. But if this works, this method clearly is returning. It's returning a bool for whether or not it worked, and then it's returning the actual user info somewhere else, right here, and that gets used here, here, and here. So my claims are going to show that's a user ID. I don't know what that is, but there it is, tdtsexample.com. Oh, that went away too quickly. Did it again. There's one that lets me, there it is. TDTS at example. So the username is coming across as persistent state. Okay. If you were wondering whether the token or anything was, it's not. Backing out of this is actually harder than I thought. I'm struggling to back out of Control F4 or Control 4. That's because you hit escape to back out. Nope. Oh, I've done a number with zoom it.
Yeah, really.
Yeah. I was thinking, can I get to the other screen? No.
Uh-oh.
I've used this. There we go. So all I did there, in case people are wondering, is I kind of waited a second without panicking and hit Control 4 again, which I thought was the way in and way out, but let's not do that again for now. And all we're really doing is remember, do you remember way back when early in this talk, early in our meetup today, that we said, okay, when authentication state has changed, we're going to get a task. The reason why is because whatever it is that you use to read out that authentication state might be awaitable. Could be coming from a database, could be coming from the network. So we keep this task. And then right now we're seeing the task is going to get written. Oh, look at this mess that I made. Okay. The task is getting written here. We're creating a task in authentication state. We're creating a task out of authentication state with a new claims principal and making an identity. And the identity is going to have the claims array that we created here. And then we're just saying that, hey, this authentication type is of this type persistent authentication state provider. And I'll admit it feels a little magical, but this is filling up the authentication state the server side is going to remember. So do all that. And then after all that, welcome to your new app. I can click on auth required. It knows who I am.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, if there's kind of like a somewhat scary part of this, is it's very easy to go through it and say like, okay, I don't really feel like I know how to implement my own yet.
Right.
I think that we could do well to take this and use it basically as is, and that the trick would be to modifying what we do here and almost most specifically right there.
Yep.
Modify the claims so that it's the information you needed claims, just as if you had a claims principal on the server side. But instead of going to HTTP context and saying who's the logged in user, you're getting it here served up to you in your component.
Mm-hmm.
So we have 10 minutes left. And what we haven't talked about yet, we've talked a lot about, and I apologize for what seems like a little bit of hand waving. We talked about how I believe when we go to implement this from scratch, that we will go a long way by simply just take the persistent and persisting auth state provider that are in the box. I think they're going to work for us to get the ball rolling. I think we may find that we are going to go to the persistent authentication state provider, the one used on the client side, and we might consider saying we need another claim.
Yeah.
We need like the role for this user or something.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know that you have to touch more of this. I can understand kind of a yearning to say, but I want to know how it works so I know what to do if I do have to change it.
Right.
And like all things, maybe we'll, as time goes on, we'll get there and we'll say, oh, remember when we thought this was really complicated? So what we need to look at now is let's look at that auth page, because specifically that auth page is the one that is getting out that claim because it showed our email. So it must be getting the claim out. Let's see what that looks like.
Okay.
This is the interesting thing. It doesn't look any different than what we've done so far, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just context comes in. Context, which is this is now beginning to become a little bit clearer as context comes in as a field on an authentication state instance. That was confusing to us at the beginning, is why isn't this an HTTP context? Well, this is why, because this is allowing Blazor to pass around authentication state instead of having the whole entire framework rely on HTTP context, which is something we as ASP.NET developers were used to doing in Razor Pages and MVC, which were pure server-side frameworks. We have an abstraction now that lets us kind of work both.
Yeah.
If I go back to Blazor auth from scratch, in Blazor auth from scratch, in our home page, remember, this is a server-side app. Oh, I guess we're not doing it in the homepage. We're doing it in the big account status component, aren't we? Is that where we're doing this? Yes. In the big account status component, because what I wanted to do is, we remember, if you've been following along, we're getting it out of the page. Yep. This context that we're referring to is also an authentication state context. So what I'm showing this for is to kind of give you some comfort that you don't have to change what you might have gotten used to server side. You can still use that in your client side components, which is this one here in the template.
Okay.
And what we're going to do now is I can get the name of the current user. I'm wondering if, with just a few minutes left, I'm wondering if we can also get out that user ID. Just to kind of show like, hey, where was that claim added? Let's go look.
You look in the claims?
User info. Yeah, I think you're right. I think claim name identifier is the claim type, though.
Okay.
So the claim, we made a claim called name, and that was automatically pushed to be the context.user. Well, let's go back and look before I misquote it. Context.user.identity.name was already, but this is called a name identifier. Let's see if it's built in, because it might be, so that we don't actually have to go digging through claims. No, I see, I'm not seeing it. So user.identity. It might be on user, isn't it?
It is. It's claims as a user property.
Okay, correct claims. And now we're going to say first for default.
Yeah.
And I have to say claim goes to a claim whose, is it type?
Yeah.
Equals, and it was called, well, actually, let's do this. Claims. Let's see if it lets me do this. Persistent provider. Because this is a string, right? Yep. Sure, I could put the string in. Let's not do that. And now I'm guessing that, yeah, I figured that there would be, we got to add a using there. So
yeah,
might like that, might not. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, we're going to get this out. We're going to go to claims, and we're going to say first or default. It's not complaining to me about anything possibly being null. So we're going to say your user ID is, and maybe not the best thing, because you might want to check first if it's null before you splat that out there.
Right.
But What I'm trying to show here, though, is that I feel that we could add the claims we want in the persisting and persistent providers. We could add the what we want in there, and then we could pull it back out. Essentially, we could add whatever state we want. We could pull whatever state we want back out, and we could use that effectively in our application. So if I go to auth required, I think we're logged in. It sure is thinking about it, though.
I think on a breakpoint.
Am I on a breakpoint for real? Yeah, I am. Let's get rid of that breakpoint so that we don't get stuck there. Thank you for that. And so that did work, right?
Wow.
And really, this is just to make it less mysterious for you, is we have a capability to, using the authentication state provider that comes in the box, and I don't believe you would have to change any code here. Not in this one. This is the server. Oh, sorry. My bad. This is the server side one. My take is you don't have to change. Well, maybe I'm wrong, because look at this. This is what you would do. You would come here. This is it. So on persisting async. So scratch that. I should even delete that part from the video, because I was going to say, I don't think you have to change anything. I think it's going to write all the claims, but no, it doesn't. This code in on persisting async, when it's called, when we register on persisting, I guess this makes sense. What is it that we do? Well, what we want to do is we want to say, okay, let's get that authentication state. Let's get the claims out. Let's write the claims as JSON, because persistent component state is a key value store that you can persist however you want. But here we're persisting it as JSON. And then over in the persistent authentication state provider, you open it back up. You open back up that persistent state. You get out the JSON fields into a user info object, and then you write the claims that you want. So you still get to live in the ASP.NET identity claims principal world that you're used to. But this part here and this part here might require some customization if you decide that your application perhaps is role-based. What if it's role-based?
Yeah.
And you say, or maybe it's not role-based. Maybe there's a policy to it. Maybe the policy for your site, I know this is going to, I like to use the DMV bartender example, which has nothing to do with what we're doing. Maybe your site is age-based. You got to be, the claim has to show that you're 21. I have no idea. To be honest, there actually is some use case for this. There are a lot of, I know a lot of times when I'm shopping on game sites like Steam or Epic Game Store or Microsoft Store, if they do a double check that you're over 13, because certain ratings of games in the United States, you have to check that the user's over 13. And I don't know if that's coming as a claim, but certainly there's a good use of it.
Sure.
So what I think will be interesting is to figure out, as we begin to try to do this from scratch, and we take an application that has no authentication and we figure out what to add to make the client-side components work, how much of these pieces do we just pull as is?
Right.
And then because I really do think that we won't yet need all this database work and the sign-in manager. I don't believe that we will need them yet. We won't need the email sending. Those are all great things, and you can certainly learn from them. But the whole point of what we've been doing here for a while is, how do we do this from scratch?
Exactly.
So that is it for today. We didn't even get to auto.
No.
And I think it's because I'm not really sure auto's that different.
Okay.
If I look real quick and I go to program, well, no. We have a different authentication state provider, the persisting revalidating authentication state provider. But let's go see what we have on the other side. We have the persistent authentication state provider. So that's the same?
Yeah.
The same. Yeah. So client side, they don't change it. I'm going to guess. I'm going to take a look. That looks familiar. This looks pretty familiar. But on the server side for InteractiveAuto, it's different. And I'm wondering how much of this is to try and handle the use cases that come about from figuring out whether you're server side or whether you're client side, we'll have to look at that.
Yeah, that'd be fun to dig into.
Yeah. So yet another authentication state provider that is being used. They kind of tell you why. So how interesting.
Okay. Yeah, that'd be cool.
We'll have to look and see what the differences are here, but there's certainly more issues that come up in auto, at least in the template. All right. Well, I don't know if I am more confused.
I think I wouldn't say more confused. I mean, I think there are definitely some things that you showed some different paths forward depending on what it is that we want to capture, what we might want to include for, seeing what you can see or not see. I think there's, you've opened up some avenues that I think we now need to continue exploring, where those paths take us.
Yeah, right. And I think the templates, as people do know, the templates make an assumption that you are going to use cookie-based auth, and that even goes for client side.
Mm-hmm.
There are quite a few people who have approached and said, how do I do the pure SPA approach with token-based, like access and refresh-based auth?
Yeah.
And I think by doing this from scratch, we can get there to where when in our code we say add cookie for an auth scheme, I think we're going to get to where we add something else. I'm not sure I want to commit here and say that it's just add JWT token with the auth scheme name and you're done. I don't know that that's it, because then I think you run into interesting issues of like, okay, so how do you get the refresh token, and how do you deal with that? That might be implementation we have to do.
Mm-hmm.
It is a place that I think we'd like to get to answer those questions, but we're not there quite yet.
We're getting there.
Yeah. I do want to show folks the one last thing I want to show them is,
okay.
And I forgot about this. So we'll get I'm trying to make sure that all of this doesn't come up, and let me get my, and then of course, I think that did my audio come through there?
I did not hear it on
you didn't hear it? Okay, well, maybe you didn't. Maybe you didn't. Basically, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get to an episode of Blazor Train that's coming up.
Okay.
So our good friend Carl Franklin, who I have had the distinct pleasure of meeting and interviewing. I will never forget that, Carl. Thank you very much for that wonderful moment when you came out to us at Philly.net. He's doing a show next week on the 29th. Authentication and authorization in Blazor WebAssembly. Carl Franklin's Blazor Train, episode 27. I'm going to grab the link to it. I'm going to make sure that it's in the chat. I do not know what and how Carl is going to cover it, but look, it's Carl Franklin. He specializes in Blazor. He does a weekly show with Jeff Fritz called The Blazor Puzzle. Frankly, you go to the Dev Express YouTube channel and you click live, and you're going to see that, like, the Blazor Puzzle with him and Jeff, and you're going to see Blazor Train. You see other stuff too.
Mm-hmm.
I will admit, and if Dev Express, if you're listening, I don't know that these playlists are all up to date. Yeah, I kind of wish, like, get these playlists up to date. I do think, though, that Blazor Train seems fine. Blazor Train seems like it's okay, fine. So, at least I think so. Well, anyways, the point is that I saw this is coming up, so I figured a lot of folks watching today may want to see that episode.
Definitely.
All right, we should get out of here.
Oh yeah, we went a little long. That's okay, not terrible. Cool. Well, awesome stuff as always, Chris. It was great to dig into that and kind of see how we can, like you said, there's code in there that we own now, and how we can make it our own.
Yeah.
So if you're watching now or watching in the future, feel free to give us a little like down below for the video up on YouTube. If you're watching us from the LinkedIn side, we'd love to have you subscribe to the LinkedIn channel that we have over there, so we can be able to stream out there at some point on that, but at least for right now, we're you can see us on YouTube. All of our stuff winds up on there, this live stuff and the stuff that's archived as well. So for that, I'm going to sign off. I know we're going to try and do a show next week before I leave for traveling again. So with that, everyone have a great weekend. And
great weekend.
Chris, have a great weekend as well. We'll see you next time on the Dev Talk Show.